The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as Prince William prepared for what seemed like an ordinary legal, ceremonial duty. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and freshly cut grass. He adjusted his formal military uniform, checking each button and medal with practiced precision. These events had become routine over the years. Public appearances where he represented the crown with dignity and composure. Yet something about this particular day felt different. Though he couldn't quite place why, the ceremony was scheduled to commemorate a historic military regiment, one that had served the British monarchy for over 3 centuries. Hundreds of guests were expected, including foreign dignitaries, military veterans, and members of parliament. The palace staff had been preparing for weeks, ensuring every detail was perfect. The red carpet had been rolled out, the brass band was warming up, and security personnel had positioned themselves strategically throughout the venue. Prince William walked through the palace corridors, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. He passed portraits of his ancestors, each face a reminder of the weight of responsibility that came with his position. His private secretary walked beside him, briefing him on the schedule and the guests he would meet. William listened attentively, though his mind wandered occasionally to his family waiting at home. He thought of his children, their laughter still ringing in his ears from breakfast that morning. As he approached the main entrance, he could hear the murmur of the gathering crowd outside. The ceremonial guards had already taken their positions, standing at attention in their immaculate uniforms. These were the Queen's Guard, soldiers who had trained rigorously for the honor of protecting royal residences and representing British military excellence. William had always held deep respect for these men and women who stood for hours in all-weather conditions, maintaining perfect discipline and composure. The palace doors opened, and William stepped into the sunlight. Cameras flashed immediately, capturing his every movement. He maintained his composure, offering a polite smile to the assembled guests. The band began playing the national anthem, and everyone stood at attention. William's eyes scanned the scene, taking in the carefully arranged chairs, the fluttering Union Jack flags, and the rows of guards standing like statues along the perimeter. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to plan. The senior military officials greeted him with formal salutes, and he returned them with practiced precision. He began making his way down the receiving line, shaking hands and exchanging brief pleasantries with veterans who had served the crown with distinction. Their faces told stories of sacrifice and dedication, and William made sure to give each person his full attention, even if only for a moment. Then, in the corner of his vision, something caught his attention. One of the ceremonial guards, a young soldier standing at the far end of the courtyard, appeared to be swaying slightly. It was barely noticeable, a subtle movement that most people would have missed. But William had been trained to observe details, to notice when something was amiss. The guard's face had gone pale, and small beads of sweat were forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. William continued with the ceremony. He kept glancing toward the guard. The young man was clearly struggling, his jaw clenched with determination as he tried to maintain his position. William recognized the signs immediately. The guard had been standing at attention for too long, likely without proper hydration or rest. The rigid stance required of ceremonial guards restricted blood flow, and combined with the stress of the occasion, it was causing the soldier to experience the early stages of fainting. The prince faced a dilemma. Protocol dictated that he continue with the ceremony without interruption. Any deviation from the planned schedule would draw attention and potentially embarrass the guard who was struggling. Yet his human instinct told him that action was needed. He had served in the military himself, had experienced the physical demands of duty, and understood the pressure these young soldiers felt to perform flawlessly. As he shook hands with another dignitary, William made a decision. He would not ignore what he was seeing. The guard's condition was deteriorating rapidly now. His knees were beginning to buckle, and he was gripping his rifle tightly, using it as support to stay upright. In seconds, the young man would collapse, potentially injuring himself and causing a disruption far greater than any intentional pause in the ceremony, without breaking his stride. William excused himself from the dignitary he was speaking with and began walking directly toward the struggling guard. His private secretary looked confused, checking the schedule to see if this was part of the plan. It wasn't. Members of the royal household exchanged concerned glances. This was highly unusual behavior, a departure from protocol that could have consequences. The cameras followed William's movement, operators adjusting their lenses to capture whatever was about to happen. The crowd's attention shifted, whispers spreading through the assembled guests. What was the prince doing? Why was he breaking formation? The military officials looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene or allow the situation to unfold. William reached the guard, just as the young man's legs were about to give way completely. Up close, he could see the soldier was barely conscious, fighting with every ounce of strength to remain standing. His eyes were unfocused, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Without hesitation, William placed a steady hand on the guard's shoulder, his voice low, but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "Stand down, soldier," William said gently, but firmly. "You've done your duty admirably." The guard's eyes flickered with recognition and relief. But before he could respond or move, his body finally gave in to the physical strain. His knees buckled, and he began to collapse forward. William reacted instantly, catching the young man before he could hit the ground. The prince's military training kicked in automatically. He supported the guard's weight, carefully lowering him to a sitting position against the palace wall. The entire courtyard had gone silent. Every eye was fixed on the unfolding scene. The band had stopped playing mid-note. Photographers captured every moment, their cameras clicking rapidly. This was unprecedented, a member of the royal family directly intervening in a military ceremony. Physically assisting a struggling guard in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras, William loosened the guard's collar and signaled for medical assistance. Within seconds, palace medical staff who had been stationed nearby rushed forward with water and equipment. The prince stayed with the guard, speaking to him in calm, reassuring tones,
Asking questions
to assess his condition and keep him conscious. He didn't seem concerned about the dirt now smudged on his formal uniform or the fact that he had completely halted the ceremony. The senior military officials approached, their expressions a mixture of concern and confusion. They began to apologize profusely to the prince, embarrassed that one of their guards had faltered during such an important event. But William waved off their apologies, his focus entirely on the young soldier who was now sipping water and beginning to regain some color in his face. "He's a credit to his regiment," William told the officers. "Standing at attention in these conditions requires tremendous discipline. There's no shame in the human body reaching its limits." As the medical staff confirmed that the guard would be fine, William helped him to his feet. The young soldier, still somewhat dazed, attempted to salute, but William gently stopped him and instead shook his hand. The gesture was simple but powerful. A prince treating a common soldier not as a subordinate, but as a fellow human being deserving of dignity and respect. The crowd began to applaud. What had started as a potential embarrassment had transformed into something else entirely. A moment of genuine humanity that transcended formal protocol. William returned to his position, nodded to the band director to resume the music, and the ceremony continued. But the atmosphere had changed. There was a warmth now, sense that something meaningful had just occurred, as William completed the remainder of the ceremony. Shaking more hands and delivering his prepared remarks, he noticed the glances and whispers continuing around him. Some looked approving, others seemed uncertain. He knew that his actions would be analyzed and debated. There would be discussions in palace circles about whether he had handled the situation appropriately, whether he had compromised the dignity of the ceremony or enhanced it. The event concluded without further incident. As guests departed and the courtyard slowly emptied, William retreated to his private chambers. He changed out of his soiled uniform, his mind replaying the morning's events. He wondered about the young guard, whether he was recovering properly, whether there would be consequences for him within the military hierarchy for his moment of weakness. His private secretary entered with a stack of messages and a concerned expression. The media had already begun reporting on the incident, and the palace communications team was preparing a statement. Social media was erupting with commentary, the footage of William catching the guard spreading rapidly across platforms. Some praised the prince's compassion and quick thinking. Others questioned whether he had overstepped, whether his intervention had been appropriate or had undermined military discipline. William listened to the various reactions with a mixture of interest and resignation. He knew that everything he did was subject to intense scrutiny, that even acts of basic human decency would be analyzed through multiple lenses. But he also knew that he had done what felt right in the moment, what his conscience and his training had told him was necessary. That evening, he received a personal message from the young guard, delivered through official channels. The soldier expressed his deep gratitude and profound embarrassment in equal measure. He thanked the prince for his kindness, but worried about the attention the incident had brought. William sent back a brief response, encouraging the young man not to worry, assuring him that he had represented his regiment with honor. As night fell over Kensington Palace, William stood by his window. Looking out at the now empty courtyard where the morning's drama had unfolded, he thought about duty and humanity, about the sometimes competing demands of protocol and conscience. He had acted on instinct, choosing compassion over ceremony, and now he would face whatever consequences came from that choice. What he didn't know, couldn't have anticipated in that quiet moment of reflection, was that his simple act of helping a struggling soldier would set in motion a chain of events that would expose uncomfortable truths about the royal household, challenge long-standing protocols, and ultimately force a reckoning with traditions that many considered sacred and untouchable. The aftermath would prove far more complicated and embarrassing for the court than anyone could have imagined, and William himself would find himself at the center of a controversy that would make headlines for weeks to come. The morning after the ceremony, William woke to find his actions had become international news. Every major newspaper carried the story on their front pages, most featuring the striking photograph of him catching the falling guard. The headlines varied wildly in tone. Some celebrated him as a compassionate leader who valued human welfare over rigid protocol. Others questioned whether his intervention had been appropriate, whether it had set a dangerous precedent for breaking with tradition. During official ceremonies, the palace communications team had been working through the night, fielding calls from journalists around the world. Television networks replayed the footage endlessly, with commentators debating every aspect of the incident. Social media had exploded with opinions, the hashtag trending globally as people from all walks of life weighed in on what had happened. The young guard, whose identity the military had tried to protect, was soon identified by online sleuths. Adding another layer of pressure to an already intense situation, William attended his scheduled morning meetings. But he could sense the tension in the air. Staff members were more formal than usual, their conversations carefully measured. His private secretary briefed him on the media coverage, presenting a thick folder of articles, blog posts, and social media commentary. The reaction was more divided than William had anticipated. While public sentiment seemed largely supportive, there were troubling undercurrents in the responses from certain quarters. Several senior members of the royal household had requested urgent meetings. William knew what that meant. There would be concerns about protocol, questions about whether he had consulted anyone before acting, discussions about precedent and tradition. The machinery of the monarchy moved slowly and deliberately, resistant to spontaneity or deviation from established norms. His instinctive act of kindness was now being examined through the harsh lens of institutional scrutiny. The first meeting was with Lord Chamberlain, the most senior officer of the royal household. The elderly man entered William's office with a grave expression. Carrying himself with the formal dignity that came from decades of service to the crown, he sat down carefully, arranging his notes on the desk between them. William braced himself for criticism, but what came was far more complex than simple disapproval. "Your Royal Highness," the Lord Chamberlain began, his voice measured and careful, "your actions yesterday have created a rather delicate situation. I want to be clear that nobody questions your motives or your compassion. However, there are concerns that need to be addressed." William listened as the older man outlined the issues. The break-in protocol had been noted by military officials, some of whom felt that the ceremonial integrity of the event had been compromised. There were questions about whether William's intervention had undermined the guard's authority and dignity, whether it had inadvertently suggested that ceremonial duties were less important than they actually were. More concerning were whispers that his actions might encourage other guards to falter. knowing that they would be rescued rather than expected to maintain their positions. But as the Lord Chamberlain continued, William began to sense that something else was happening. The concerns being raised felt performative, as though they were being voiced out of obligation rather than genuine worry. The older man's eyes showed something different than his words conveyed, a hint of approval that contradicted his formal critique. William had learned over the years to read between the lines, to understand the complex dynamics of palace politics. "May I speak frankly, sir?" William asked, interrupting the prepared remarks. The Lord Chamberlain paused, then nodded with a slight smile. "I wish you would, Your Royal Highness. These concerns you're outlining, do you actually share them? Or are you conveying objections from others?" The older man's formal demeanor cracked slightly. He leaned back in his chair, the official papers forgotten. "You have good instincts, sir. I personally believe you did exactly what any decent person would have done. But there are factions within the household and beyond it who are deeply uncomfortable with what happened yesterday. Not because they lack compassion, but because they fear change, fear precedent, fear anything that might challenge the established order." This was a rare moment of candor, and William appreciated it. Who specifically is uncomfortable? Several senior advisors to other members of the family, some military traditionalists who believe ceremonial discipline must be absolute. And he paused, choosing his words carefully. There are those who worry that your actions highlighted a problem they would prefer remained hidden. What problem? William pressed. The conditions under which ceremonial guards are expected to perform. The lack of adequate preparation, hydration, and support. The pressure they feel to never falter, never show weakness, even when their health is at risk. Your actions yesterday didn't just help one young soldier, sir. They shone a spotlight on systemic issues that certain people would rather not address. This revelation shifted everything. William had acted on instinct, responding to an immediate crisis. He hadn't considered the broader implications, the systems and structures his simple gesture had inadvertently called into question. Now he understood why the reaction had been so complicated, so divided. He had exposed an uncomfortable truth that many would prefer to keep buried. Over the following days, more information began to emerge. Journalists, energized by the public interest in the story, started investigating the treatment and conditions of ceremonial guards. They discovered troubling patterns. Guards were often expected to stand at attention for multiple hours without breaks, sometimes in extreme weather conditions, with inadequate preparation or medical support. There were records of previous fainting incidents that had been quietly managed and never publicly acknowledged. Several former guards came forward anonymously, describing the immense pressure they had felt to never show weakness, to endure anything rather than risk embarrassing the crown. William read these reports with growing concern and anger. He had served in the military himself, understood the importance of discipline and duty. But he also knew that leadership meant taking care of those under your command, ensuring they had the resources and support needed to perform their duties safely. The system, as it currently existed, seemed to prioritize appearance over welfare, tradition over common sense. He requested meetings with military officials, pushing for detailed information about ceremonial guard protocols. Some were cooperative, sharing training procedures and medical guidelines. Others were defensive, insisting that everything was handled appropriately, that the incident with the young guard had been an isolated anomaly. William didn't believe them. The evidence suggested otherwise, and his instincts told him there was more to uncover. Meanwhile, the young guard at the center of the incident found himself in an impossible position. The military had initially treated him with understanding, praising his dedication and dismissing the fainting episode as a minor medical issue. But as media attention intensified and questions about guard conditions proliferated, the tone changed. Suddenly, there were suggestions that he had failed to prepare properly, that he had embarrassed his regiment, that his moment of weakness had created problems far beyond himself. William learned about this shift through back channels. He was furious. The young soldier was being scapegoated, blamed for exposing problems that existed long before his collapse. William made calls, used his influence, insisted that the guard be treated fairly, and that no disciplinary action be taken against him. But he could sense resistance, pushback from quarters that resented his interference in military affairs. The situation reached a critical point when an investigative journalist published a comprehensive report on ceremonial guard conditions. The article detailed numerous incidents over the past decade where guards had fainted, suffered heat stroke, or experienced other medical emergencies during ceremonies. It revealed inadequate training on recognizing and responding to physical distress. It included anonymous testimonies from active and former guards describing a culture that discouraged reporting problems or seeking help. The report was damning, and it created a firestorm. Military officials scrambled to respond, issuing statements about their commitment to guard welfare and announcing immediate reviews of all protocols. The palace communications team worked overtime to manage the fallout, trying to separate royal family members from what was technically a military management issue, while acknowledging their connection to ceremonial guard duties, but the damage was done. What had started as a heartwarming story of a prince helping a struggling soldier had evolved into a full-blown scandal about systemic neglect and institutional failures. And at the center of it all was William, whose simple act of kindness had triggered this cascade of revelations. Some praised him for inadvertently exposing these problems. Others blamed him for creating a crisis that damaged British military prestige and royal ceremony traditions. The pressure intensified when members of Parliament began demanding formal inquiries. Opposition politicians seized on the issue, using it to criticize government oversight of military ceremonial functions. Veteran advocacy groups called for sweeping reforms. The media coverage became relentless, with new stories emerging daily about guard conditions, royal protocols, and the culture of silence that had allowed problems to persist for years. William found himself in meetings that grew increasingly tense. Senior royals expressed concern that the ongoing controversy was damaging the monarchy's reputation. Some suggested he make a statement distancing himself from the wider debate, focusing solely on the humanitarian aspect of helping the guard without commenting on systemic issues. Others urged him to lead the charge for reform, to use his position and public support to push for meaningful changes. He struggled with the decision. Part of him wanted to retreat, to let military officials and government ministers handle the fallout from revelations he had never intended to cause. But another part, the part that had instinctively reached out to catch a falling soldier, knew that silence would be a betrayal of the very values his action had represented. If he stepped back now, nothing would change. The spotlight would eventually move on. Reforms would be promised, but never fully implemented. And future guards would continue suffering under inadequate conditions. The young guard contacted him again, this time requesting a private meeting. William agreed immediately, curious about what the soldier wanted to say. They met quietly at Kensington Palace, away from cameras and public attention. The young man looked tired, stressed by the unwanted fame and the controversy swirling around him, but his eyes showed determination. "Sir, I need to tell you something," the guard began, his voice steady despite obvious nervousness. "What happened that day? It wasn't just about me. There were 3 other guards at that ceremony who were also struggling. I just happened to be the one who couldn't hold on any longer. But the conditions, the preparation, the lack of support, it affects all of us. We're trained to never complain, never show weakness. And because of that, these problems never get addressed." William listened intently as the young soldier described the reality of ceremonial guard duty. The long hours of standing perfectly still, often with inadequate hydration or nutrition beforehand. The extreme weather conditions they endured, from freezing winters to sweltering summers, with uniforms designed for appearance rather than comfort or safety. The medical checks that were often cursory at best. The culture that treated physical limits as personal failings rather than legitimate concerns. "When you helped me that day, sir," the guard continued, "you didn't just prevent me from hurting myself. You showed that someone with your authority cares more about our well-being than about perfect ceremony. That matters more than you might realize. But now I'm worried that all of this attention, all of these investigations, they'll fade away without real change. And the next guard who struggles, there might not be someone there to catch them." This conversation crystallized everything for William. He had been viewing the situation through the lens of royal protocol and public relations. But the young guard's words reminded him of what actually mattered. The human beings who put themselves through tremendous physical and mental strain in service to traditions that others had created. His responsibility wasn't to the institution or its image. It was to the people who served it, often at great personal cost. William made his decision. He would not retreat or remain silent. Instead, he would use his position to push for genuine reform, even if it meant challenging powerful people and deeply entrenched traditions. He knew this path would bring criticism and conflict, but the alternative, allowing the controversy to fade while problems persisted, was unacceptable. He called together his closest advisors and announced his intentions. The reactions were mixed, ranging from supportive to deeply concerned. His first step was to commission an independent review of all ceremonial guard protocols, not just for royal events, but across all military ceremonial functions. He wanted medical experts, human resources specialists, and active duty guards involved in the process, ensuring diverse perspectives and genuine insight. Some military officials welcomed this initiative, recognizing the opportunity for meaningful improvement. Others resisted, viewing it as unnecessary interference and an implicit criticism of their leadership. The palace establishment reacted with alarm. Senior advisors warned that William was overstepping his role. He was entering territory traditionally managed by military and government authorities. They worried about precedent, about what would happen when other members of the royal family decided to champion causes that might create complications for the institution. There were heated discussions behind closed doors, arguments about duty versus activism, tradition versus progress. William's father reached out during this turbulent period requesting a private conversation. They met in a quiet room at Clarence House, away from staff and interruptions. The king's expression was thoughtful, his tone measured but firm. He understood his son's motivations, he said, and respected the compassion that had driven his initial actions. But he urged caution, reminding William of the delicate balance the monarchy had to maintain between visibility and restraint, between leadership and political neutrality. When you act, the institution acts, his father explained. Your gesture was admirable, but the consequences have grown beyond what anyone anticipated. You've put the military establishment in a difficult position, created political complications, and drawn the monarchy into a debate that may not serve our long-term interests. I'm not asking you to apologize or retreat entirely, but I need you to consider the broader implications of every step you take going forward. William listened respectfully, but he found himself disagreeing with parts of his father's assessment. Yes, the situation had become complicated. Yes, there were political dimensions he hadn't initially considered. But wasn't this exactly the kind of issue where the monarchy could play a constructive role? They weren't elected politicians bound by party politics. They could highlight problems, encourage dialogue, and use their influence to push for improvements that might otherwise be neglected in the grind of normal governance. With respect, Father, William responded carefully, I think we're missing an opportunity here. The public reaction has been overwhelmingly supportive precisely because people saw something authentic. Someone putting human welfare above ceremony and protocol? If we retreat now, we reinforce the perception that the monarchy is out of touch, more concerned with its own dignity than with the well-being of those who serve it. That's far more damaging in the long run than any temporary controversy. The conversation continued for over an hour, father and son exploring different perspectives on duty, responsibility, and the proper role of modern royalty. They didn't reach complete agreement, but there was mutual understanding and respect. The king wouldn't publicly oppose William's efforts, but he made clear that his son would need to navigate carefully, consulting with appropriate authorities and avoiding actions that might appear to usurp government or military functions. Armed with this qualified support, William moved forward with his plans. He met personally with the Secretary of Defense, presenting his concerns and proposals in a formal but direct manner. The minister was initially defensive, gradually became more receptive as William demonstrated thorough knowledge of the issues and offered constructive suggestions rather than mere criticism. They agreed to work together on reforms, with the government taking the lead on implementation while William provided vocal support and helped maintain public attention on the issue. The independent review he had commissioned began its work, and within weeks, preliminary findings confirmed what many had suspected. Ceremonial guard protocols had evolved over centuries with minimal consideration for modern understanding of physiology, hydration, heat stress, and other health factors. Training was inconsistent across different units. Medical screening before ceremonies was often inadequate. Support systems for guards experiencing distress were virtually non-existent, based on the assumption that well-trained soldiers should never falter. These findings were released to the public through carefully managed channels. The report didn't sensationalize or assign blame, but it documented problems clearly and offered specific recommendations. Mandatory hydration protocols before and during long ceremonies. Better training on recognizing signs of physical distress in oneself and others. Discrete support systems allowing guards to signal problems without public embarrassment. Modified uniform designs that maintain ceremonial appearance while improving comfort and safety. Regular medical checks with authority to remove guards from duty if concerns arose. The military establishment, now facing undeniable evidence and sustained public scrutiny, began implementing changes. Some reforms happened quickly, others required more time and resources. Throughout this process, William maintained a visible but measured presence. He visited training facilities, spoke with guards and their commanders, and publicly praised units that embraced reforms enthusiastically. He was careful not to claim credit or position himself as a savior, instead highlighting the work of military medical staff, unit commanders, and the guards themselves who had spoken up about their experiences. But as reforms progressed and the initial crisis seemed to be resolving, a new and unexpected problem emerged. Conservative elements within royal circles and British society began pushing back more forcefully. Newspaper columnists who specialized in defending tradition wrote increasingly critical articles about William's role in the controversy. They argued that he had damaged cherished British institutions, that his actions had undermined military discipline and ceremonial dignity, that he had allowed himself to be manipulated by progressive activists seeking to dismantle traditional structures. These attacks grew more personal and pointed. Some questioned whether William was fit for his future role, suggesting he lacked the proper respect for protocol and tradition that a monarch required. Others painted him as naive, well-meaning, but ultimately harmful, someone who had allowed emotion to override judgment. The criticism came not just from obvious sources like tabloid newspapers, but from respected voices within the establishment, retired military officers, and even some palace insiders who spoke anonymously to journalists. The young guard who had originally fainted found himself targeted as well. Despite military efforts to protect his identity, his name and background became public knowledge. Suddenly, details about his personal life, his family, his military record were being scrutinized and reported. Some coverage was sympathetic, but other outlets portrayed him less charitably, suggesting he had sought attention or allowed himself to become a symbol for causes he may not have fully understood. William was outraged by these attacks, particularly those targeting the guard. He made several attempts to shield the young soldier from further exposure, using what influence he had to discourage media harassment. But the coverage continued, driven by the unresolved tension between those who saw the entire episode as a positive moment of reform and those who viewed it as an embarrassing breakdown of discipline and tradition. The situation reached its most humiliating point during a formal state dinner. The event was meant to honor visiting foreign dignitaries and showcase British royal tradition at its finest. William attended with other family members, dressed in full ceremonial regalia, prepared to perform his duties with the grace and dignity expected of his position. The evening began smoothly, with guests arriving and being received according to carefully choreographed protocol. But during the dinner, one of the visiting dignitaries, an elderly duke from a European monarchy known for its strict adherence to ancient traditions, raised the subject of the guard incident. His tone was polite, but his message was clear. He spoke about the importance of maintaining ceremonial standards, about how the younger generations sometimes failed to understand that traditions served important purposes beyond mere pageantry. He suggested that compassion, while admirable, must be balanced with respect for institutional dignity and the discipline required to maintain it. The comment hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Other guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. William felt all eyes turning toward him, waiting to see how he would handle this direct, though diplomatically phrased, criticism. He could have deflected, changed the subject, or offered a vague platitude that acknowledged both perspectives without taking a firm stand. That would have been the safe choice, the path of least conflict. Instead, William set down his fork and looked directly at the elderly Duke. His voice was respectful but firm, carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet dining room. He thanked the Duke for his perspective and acknowledged the value of tradition and ceremony. But then he spoke about his own military service, about the young men and women who put their physical well-being at risk to maintain these ceremonies, and about the responsibility that came with commanding their service. "With respect, Your Grace," William said, "I believe true dignity comes not from perfect performance of ritual, but from how we treat those who serve us. A ceremony may look flawless to observers, but if it requires people to endure unsafe conditions or risk their health, then something essential is wrong with that ceremony. Tradition should elevate our values, not contradict them. And our highest value must be the welfare of those who dedicate themselves to serving institutions like ours." The silence that followed was profound. Some guests nodded in agreement, others looked scandalized. The elderly Duke's face reddened, though whether from anger or embarrassment was unclear. William had just contradicted a senior foreign royal at a formal state function, had essentially lectured him on values and priorities. It was a breach of diplomatic etiquette, a moment that would be analyzed and discussed in royal circles across Europe. His father caught his eye from across the table, an expression mixing concern and something that might have been pride. Other family members looked mortified. The palace staff serving the dinner moved with practiced efficiency, but William could sense their tension. This would be discussed, dissected, criticized. He had created another incident, another moment where his actions would be questioned and debated. The dinner continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations became more guarded, more formal. The spontaneous warmth that sometimes developed at these events never materialized. When the evening finally concluded and guests departed, William knew he would face consequences. He had let his passion override diplomatic judgment, had allowed a formal state occasion to become a platform for expressing his views on a controversial subject. That night, alone in his rooms, William questioned his choices. Had he gone too far? Had his determination to stand by his principles actually damaged the causes he was trying to advance? The path he had chosen, to openly challenge established practices and defend reforms, was proving far more complicated and costly than he had anticipated. Every action seemed to generate new controversies, new criticisms, new complications. His phone buzzed with messages from advisors, most urgent and concerned. There would be meetings tomorrow, damage control efforts, attempts to smooth over the diplomatic awkwardness he had created. The media would have a field day with what had happened at the dinner. Dissecting his words and speculating about rifts within royal circles, his critics would point to this as further evidence of his poor judgment and inability to maintain proper decorum. But amid all these concerns, William also received a message from the young guard. It was brief but heartfelt, expressing gratitude not just for the initial rescue, but for William's continued support and willingness to face criticism rather than abandon the reforms that were beginning to make real differences in guards' lives. The soldier mentioned that new protocols had already been implemented in his unit, that the changes were making ceremonial duties safer and more manageable, that morale had improved because people felt their welfare actually mattered to leadership. This message reminded William why he had chosen this difficult path. The embarrassment he felt tonight, the diplomatic complications he had created, the criticism he would face tomorrow, all of that mattered less than the real improvements happening for people who deserved better treatment. He had helped one falling guard on a palace courtyard, but that simple gesture had evolved into something larger. something that might actually make lasting positive changes in how ceremonial duties were conducted and how the people performing them were valued and protected. The weeks following the state dinner were among the most challenging of William's public life. The incident with the elderly Duke became international news, with royal commentators and diplomats weighing in on whether he had acted appropriately or had committed a serious breach of protocol. The controversy reignited all the previous debates about his role in the Guard reforms, with critics using the dinner confrontation as evidence that he lacked the temperament and judgment needed for his future responsibilities. Several senior diplomats quietly expressed concern to the palace about potential damage to relationships with other European monarchies. The elderly Duke's country, though small, maintained close historical ties with Britain, and the perceived slight had created genuine diplomatic awkwardness. William was asked to consider writing a private letter of apology, not for his views, but for the manner and setting in which he had expressed them. He agonized over this request, understanding the diplomatic necessities but reluctant to appear as though he was backing down from his principles. Ultimately, he crafted a carefully worded letter that acknowledged the inappropriate setting for his comments. While standing firmly behind the substance of what he had said, he expressed respect for the Duke and for ceremonial traditions, but also clearly stated his belief that welfare and safety must always be paramount considerations. The letter was received politely but coolly, doing little to fully repair the diplomatic strain. William accepted that some bridges might remain damaged, the cost of standing by convictions that not everyone shared. Meanwhile, the reforms he had championed were producing tangible results. Military units responsible for ceremonial duties reported significant improvements in Guard welfare and performance. The new hydration and medical monitoring protocols had prevented several potential fainting incidents. Guards reported feeling more supported and valued, knowing that their physical limits would be respected rather than ignored. Training programs had been revamped to include comprehensive education on recognizing and responding to physical distress, both in oneself and in fellow guards. These successes attracted positive media coverage. Though less sensational than the earlier controversies, documentary makers and journalists highlighted the changes, interviewing guards who described how different their experiences were compared to just months earlier. Medical professionals praised the reforms as common-sense measures that should have been implemented years ago. Veteran organizations expressed satisfaction that current service members would no longer face the same unsafe conditions that earlier generations had endured in silence. But William noticed something troubling in how these achievements were being framed. Much of the coverage credited the military establishment and government ministers for their leadership and quick action in implementing reforms. His own role was either minimized or presented ambiguously, with some outlets suggesting his initial involvement had been more problematic than helpful, creating drama and controversy that others had to resolve. This revisionist narrative frustrated him, but his advisors counseled patience and silence, arguing that taking credit would only reignite debates about his motivations and appropriateness. The young guard, at the center of the original incident, had completed his ceremonial posting and moved on to other duties. He maintained occasional contact with William, providing updates on how reforms were affecting his unit and expressing continued gratitude for the changes that had resulted from one moment of human weakness. The soldier had struggled with the unwanted attention and scrutiny, but he told William that seeing real improvements made the difficult experience feel worthwhile. He planned to make the military his career, and he felt optimistic about serving in an institution that seemed to be learning and adapting. 6 months after the original ceremony, William was invited to attend another major ceremonial event, this one marking the anniversary of a historic military victory. The invitation came with some tension, as it would be the first large ceremonial gathering since the controversies had erupted. Military officials and palace staff worked carefully to ensure every detail was perfect. Conscious that the event would be scrutinized for any signs of ongoing problems or further incidents, William prepared for the ceremony with mixed emotions. Part of him wanted to decline, to avoid the awkwardness and the inevitable media commentary comparing this event to the previous one. But refusing would send the wrong message, suggesting either fear or continued conflict with the military establishment. He needed to demonstrate that the reforms had been about improvement, not confrontation, and that he respected and valued ceremonial traditions when they were conducted with proper care for participants. The morning of the ceremony was cold and overcast, with a sharp wind cutting through the parade ground. As William arrived, he immediately noticed differences from the previous event. Medical staff were positioned more visibly, with clear protocols for monitoring guard conditions. The guards themselves looked well-prepared and alert, their uniforms modified slightly to accommodate better insulation against the weather. Hydration stations had been set up discreetly, accessible to guards during approved break periods that had been built into the ceremony schedule. The ceremony proceeded smoothly. With military precision and dignity, William performed his duties with practiced grace, conscious that every gesture would be analyzed for signs of his attitude toward ceremonial traditions. He made a point of acknowledging the guards' professionalism, noting in his brief remarks how well they represented British military excellence. The crowd responded warmly, and the media coverage afterward was largely positive, praising both the ceremony's execution and the evident improvements in how guards were supported. After the event concluded, William was approached by several senior military officers who had initially resisted the reforms. They thanked him, somewhat awkwardly, for pushing changes that had genuinely improved ceremonial operations. One retired colonel admitted that he had been wrong to view the reforms as attacks on tradition, that he now recognized they had actually strengthened ceremonial functions by ensuring guards could perform their duties safely and sustainably. These conversations were gratifying, though tinged with frustration that the same officials had earlier contributed to the criticism and controversy. The young guard from the original incident attended the ceremony as a spectator. Having been invited by his former regiment, William spotted him in the crowd afterward and made a point of speaking with him privately. They talked about the changes, about how the military culture around ceremonial duties seemed to be shifting, about the soldier's plans for his continued career. The young man had matured through the experience, his confidence bolstered by surviving intense scrutiny and seeing positive change emerge from his moment of weakness. "You know, sir," the guard said thoughtfully, "I've spoken with guards across different units, and the impact of what happened goes beyond just the physical protocols. There's a sense now that it's okay to be human, to have limits, to ask for help when needed. That culture shift might be even more important than the specific rule changes. You helped create that by showing that compassion and strength aren't opposites." This observation struck William deeply. He had been so focused on tangible reforms, on medical protocols and safety procedures, that he hadn't fully appreciated the cultural transformation that had occurred. The military, particularly its ceremonial functions, had long prized stoic endurance above all else. By publicly prioritizing a guard's welfare over ceremony, William had challenged that culture in ways that formal policy changes alone could never have achieved. As months passed and the acute controversies faded, William reflected on everything that had happened since that autumn morning when he had caught a falling guard. The experience had taught him uncomfortable lessons about institutional resistance to change, about how good intentions could create complicated consequences, about the personal costs of standing by principles when powerful forces pushed back. He had been humiliated at times, had made diplomatic mistakes, had created problems for people trying to manage complex institutions. But he had also learned about the power of authentic action, about how a single moment of genuine human concern could spark conversations and changes that careful speeches and formal initiatives might never achieve. The guard reforms were real and lasting, improving lives in concrete ways. The cultural shift within ceremonial military units was creating space for more humane approaches to duty and discipline. And perhaps most importantly, the public had seen a member of the royal family prioritize human welfare over appearances, demonstrating that traditional institutions could adapt and improve without losing their essential character. The humiliation the court had experienced, the diplomatic awkwardness, the internal conflicts and painful debates, all of it had been necessary. Change rarely came easily or cleanly, especially in institutions as old and tradition-bound as the British monarchy and military. Comfortable people in positions of authority seldom reformed systems voluntarily. It took disruption, controversy, and sustained pressure to overcome institutional inertia and defensive resistance. William came to understand that his role, perhaps more than he had previously realized, involved being willing to endure these battles, to accept personal criticism and institutional pushback when fighting for causes that mattered. It meant sometimes choosing conscience over comfort, values over easy popularity with establishment figures who preferred stability to improvement. This was different from the passive ceremonial role he had been raised to expect, but perhaps more authentic to what modern leadership required. A year after the original incident, a formal ceremony was held to recognize the successful implementation of the new ceremonial guard protocols. Military officials, government ministers, and royal family members attended to mark the achievement. William was given a prominent role, his contributions acknowledged more generously than they had been during the controversy. Several guards who had helped develop and test the new procedures were honored, including the young soldier whose collapse had started everything. During the ceremony, William spoke briefly about lessons learned and the importance of institutions being willing to examine themselves honestly. He carefully balanced respect for tradition with emphasis on the need for continuous improvement. His remarks were measured and diplomatic, avoiding the kind of confrontational statements that had created problems at the state dinner, but the substance remained clear. Traditions were valuable, but they must serve human needs and values, not contradict them. The speech was well received, praised for its maturity and balance. Some observers noted how much William seemed to have grown through the experience, how he had learned to navigate the delicate space between advocacy and overreach, between passion and propriety. The controversies had forced him to develop skills and perspectives he would need in his future role, teaching him how to push for change while maintaining enough institutional support to be effective. As the ceremony concluded, William stood watching the guards march in perfect formation, knowing that beneath the impressive discipline and precision, real improvements had been made to protect their health and dignity. The young soldier who had once collapsed in this very courtyard now stood tall among his fellows. It's a moment of weakness, having contributed to lasting positive change. The court had been humiliated, yes, traditions had been questioned, and powerful people had been made uncomfortable. But the alternative, maintaining systems that harmed people unnecessarily, would have been far worse. Walking back through the palace that evening, William passed the courtyard, where everything had begun. He paused for a moment, remembering the split-second decision to break protocol and help a struggling guard, the choice that had changed so much. He had acted on instinct, without considering consequences or complications. If he had known then what would follow, all the controversy and criticism and conflict, would he have made the same choice? Without hesitation, he knew he would. Because some things mattered more than smooth operations and comfortable relationships with establishment figures. The dignity and welfare of people who served deserved more than performative concern. Real leadership meant being willing to act when action was needed, even knowing the costs would be high and the battles would be difficult. The reforms would continue evolving. Guards would continue serving with honor and discipline, and the monarchy would continue adapting to changing expectations and values. The incident that had seemed like such a crisis, that had humiliated so many powerful people and disrupted so many careful plans, would be remembered as a turning point, a moment when compassion had proven more important than ceremony. And when one person's willingness to act, it demonstrated that even the oldest traditions could improve without losing their essence. As William entered his private quarters, his phone showed another message from the young guard. Now thriving in his career and grateful every day for the changes that had made his service sustainable and respected, that simple message confirmed what William had come to believe, that the embarrassments and conflicts had been worth enduring, that standing by principles despite costs was the only way to create meaningful change, and that the monarchy's greatest strength lay not in rigid adherence to tradition, but in its ability to evolve while maintaining the values of service, duty and compassion that gave those traditions meaning in the first place.